Today I have some tips and tricks for you for working with slightly slippery fabrics. This is a very fine silk twill that I got via Stitch Fabrics, but I believe it's an ex Dolce & Gabbana print. I have been nervous about working with this kind of fabric for ages, so I wanted to share with you some of the tips and tricks that I use to make handling this kind of project and fabric that little bit easier. So let's get started. One of the first things that I would definitely suggest when working with both a large print like this and also a silk is to cut out on a single layer. It will be an added layer of work because you have to cut any mirrored pattern pieces out twice, but the chance of accuracy is going to be a lot higher. That's something that you definitely want to be when working with this kind of fabric, is very, very accurate, especially in the cutting out stages, because it will make working with this fabric later on a lot easier. I have laid out all my pattern pieces, making sure that they are on grain. These pieces do have a slightly squiffy grain line. I have used my tape measure to measure from the grain line to the selvage edge to make sure that they are perfectly on grain. That's another thing with slippery fabrics. You do want to try and be as accurate about cutting them out on grain as possible. This top is completely cut out on the straighter grain. There is no bias in this top whatsoever, which is another reason that I think this one's going to work quite nicely because it's a nice drapey fabric. This is actually a silk twill. Hopefully you can just see there's a really fine twill weave here. The next thing that I've done is actually cut out my pattern pieces from calico, and I've cut out multiples of them. I have pinned them into place very carefully with a lot of pins around the edge. This is just going to help everything lie nice and flatly when I'm cutting it out with scissors. I don't like rotary cutters. I would make a mess of this with a rotary cutter, and I don't have the time or the willingness to practice with a rotary cutter to get good for this particular top, so I am going to be using pins and scissors because, as I say, that's my preference. I think you can see that these pieces, there are slight ripples in them, but they are lying nice and flatly. I am going to be cutting out a scrunchie from this fabric, and you can see here the paper, even though it's been ironed flat, there's still a little bit more of like a bubble and a ridge. I think you can see it slightly better on this one from where the pins have been going through the paper and into the fabric, whereas these ones, there are still some bubbles, as you can see, so I maybe need to smooth that out again, but they are lying a lot flatter than the paper pattern would be. Plus, I've also made sure that I have mirror images of everything. So there's the two backs, two front sides, and the front. Two of my sleeve caps. I'm going to need to cut another two of those out, which I will take this pattern piece completely off the silk and put it back onto a new patch of the silk, because I need 4 of these, and this obviously gives me 2. I'm now going to very carefully cut around all of my pieces. One thing that you do want to make sure that you're doing when you are cutting out with your scissors is that you keep the blade of the scissor, the bottom blade of the scissor, on the table. You don't want to be cutting in the air. If you have to kind of like lift anything up, that will distort the pattern pieces, so you want to make sure that you are cutting with the blade going along the table like this, and don't ever take the bottom blade off of the table when you're cutting out. Wish me luck!
My preference for cutting out with scissors is to have my pattern piece to the right of the blades of my scissors, as I think you can see in a couple of these clips. I just find I am more accurate cutting out with the pattern piece on that side of the scissors, although I know some people prefer it the other way around. It's one of those things where you want to do the thing that you are most comfortable with, because this is one of the trickiest stages of making a top like this, is getting an accurate cut of your pattern pieces. You can also see that I am moving around from piece to piece. I'm not trying to cut out one singular piece in one go. I'm moving around my table. I'm very lucky that I have a table on wheels and I can pull it out and move it where I need it to be, so that I can access all the different sides of the pattern pieces to cut out using my preferred method. I will go back and forwards between different pattern pieces when they become slightly more available, because I have just done a cut up one piece, which meant that then the sleeves were easier to get to. One thing that you really don't want to do, or want to avoid as much as possible, is actually moving your pattern piece in the middle of cutting. Now you can see me here moving pattern pieces around when I can't quite get to the remaining edge that needs to be cut. I'm very carefully moving the pattern piece. I find with the calico it also sticks to the fabric very, very well, so it does make this process slightly easier. I do find that when I use paper patterns on a fabric like this, if I move things around, I then have to very carefully try and get the fabric and the pattern back into alignment along the pieces that have already been cut. But with the calico, everything kind of sticks together, there's more grip. As much as possible you want to avoid moving your pattern pieces before they're fully cut, but sometimes it's just not possible to do that, and so you want to be really careful that you're distorting things as little as possible. Once I've got everything cut out, I will then go through my different pattern pieces and put in any marks that I need. For example, the points of the darts, I will snip into the notches. There are some pivot points that need to be marked. The way I mark those is with a pin through the point of the dart, for example. I will then use a chalk pen or a friction pen on the back side of the fabric to mark that point of the dart. I can then use a ruler to join up the dart leg markings, and I like to do all of that before I remove the pattern piece from the fabric to again make sure that things don't get distorted or slightly squiffy before those marks have been made.
I have completely cleaned my machine. I've oiled it, I've changed the needle. I have a fresh 60 on because I am working with a very delicate silk. I have also got out one of my scraps and I have tested out my stitch length and the needle combination with the thread. I'm really happy with how that all looks, so I am willing to start sewing on the actual garment pieces that I have cut out and start making this top up. Something else that I'm using for sewing this is my silk pins. Theoretically, I should really use these for every single fine fabric like this viscose, and especially these sorts of silks. But I do tend to use my clover pins just because I'm so used to them. I like the big head. They're nice and if you can see that, yeah, they're nice and long. You know, I'm so used to them. Let's see a comparison between the two though. You can see the silk pins are much narrower and finer and sharper, and so you really do want to consider the type of pin that you're using for the type of fabric that you're cutting out or pinning together when you're sewing it. So I did actually use my clover-headed pins for cutting this out because I was putting the pins within the seam allowance of the garment as I was cutting things out, because I do pin perpendicular to the cut line when I'm cutting out. But when I sew, I much prefer to have my pins at a right angle to my seams. So whilst this piece is actually going through the stitching line, this is obviously piercing a hole into what will be the final visible garment. So again, these silk pins finer, sharper, and will leave less noticeable marks. Again, test this out on a scrap of fabric. If you put one of these pins or your favorite pins in, if you don't happen to have silk pins and you don't find that these create too much damage or a hole, or your fabric recovers well from them, for sure use the pins that you like and are used to. But working with something fine like this, it is worth investing in a couple of packs of silk pins, and I keep these sharp by only using them for things like this. I don't use these as frequently as I probably should, especially with viscoses, because I find viscoses are quite resilient, but I will pull them out for things like this silk twill because it is very fine and very delicate and very shifty. I think the other thing you can see here is I've used a lot of pins in these very short darts because that's what I'm sewing first. There is a full sew along for this top, the 9006. If you want to have a look at exactly the method I used to sew this top, I will link it in the description, I think up here, and also in the description, it might be up there. I will link it somewhere on the screen, but also in the description down below. But I'm using a lot more pins in this dart than I usually would, just to make sure that everything is lining up and behaving itself. If you've got a really, really shifty silk, something else that you might want to consider is actually hand basting so that the fabric really doesn't shift and move around as you're sewing it. I think I should be good with all of these pins and going slowly, and as with all darts that I sew, I will backstitch at the beginning and then I will sew off of the point of the dart and tie that into a knot, because I really don't want to add any extra bulk in this very fine fabric at the point of a very small dart. My biggest tip for you and takeaway from projects like this is that you want to be as accurate as you possibly can in the cutting out stage. If you get anything slightly off grain, or if you are not 100% accurate with cutting out the exact seam allowance, that can just create problems for you as you go along in the making process. So you do want to take your time and take all the extra steps to make sure that the pieces that you cut out are as perfect as possible. It does make the sewing process that much easier. This silk fabric does like to fray, so you really do need to consider the finishing technique you want to use for your seams. This one, as you can see, I have fully lined. There is a video talking you through drafting the lining and the process that I go through to sew this top together. If you weren't fully lining this, you could overlock, although again I would say test on a small piece of fabric to see if one, it works, and two, you're happy with the texture and result that you get. Otherwise, I would highly recommend French seams, and I have a bunch of videos on my channel talking you through different French seams. Even for princess seams, that is a possibility and something that you can do. One of the reasons I like a full lining, especially for a top like this, is because of the finish I can achieve on both the inside and the outside. You can see here this is the hem of the little sleeve cap, and there is no visible top stitching. There's also no visible top stitching around the hem of the garment, which I personally really like the look of. Even though this top will predominantly be worn tucked in, I still prefer to have no visible top stitching anywhere on the garment. I really love this calico method. I am going to be doing this going forward for other slippery fabrics and patterns. I also love having the entire pattern in calico so that I can lay it out on my available fabric and play around with print placement. As you can probably see from the beginning, this was actually a pineapple print. Because I only had a very limited amount of it, I wasn't able to pattern match over certain seams in the way that I would have liked to, which is why I've only ended up with one pineapple on the back of this top. If I'd have had slightly more fabric, I may have been able to kind of piece together something along the center front that had pineapples running across the princess seams to a certain degree, but I am really happy with the top that I've ended up with, and having those full-size pattern pieces and the full top to play around with the placement of the print was something that I really liked. Obviously, there are loads of different ways of cutting out silk. You can spray starch it if you're willing to wash the fabric afterwards. This was not a fabric that I have washed or want to wash. It's going to be a dry clean only top, so that wasn't going to be a viable method for me. But if you have got a slippery fabric that you are willing to and have washed, then take a small 10cm square, use some spray starch on it just to test that the spray starch does what you want it to, which is make the fabric stiffer, which means it's going to be easier for you to cut out, and also that the spray starch then washes out and gives you a finished feel of fabric that you actually like as well. For all of these methods, having a small scrap of fabric that you can try different things on, like the different needles, the different tensions, different stitch lengths, is a great idea before you actually start sewing or even cutting into your main precious fabric. Another method you can use for cutting out is laying down a piece of tissue paper, putting your fabric on top of it in a single layer, then adding your pattern piece on top and cutting through all of those pieces together. That obviously will slightly affect your fabric scissors because you are going to be cutting through layers of tissue paper, but it will help the fabric have something to grip to and mean that the kind of like it won't sort of float away, which is definitely something that lighter fabrics do want to do whenever they possibly can. Something else you might want to consider is a rotary cutter. I absolutely hate rotary cutters. I am not good at them. I use them for quilting. I don't use them for cutting out dressmaking projects. I just don't like them. I am not accurate with them. I would have made a mess if I had tried to cut out this top with a rotary cutter. But if you are good with rotary cutters, a mat, a layer of tissue paper, your fabric, single layer again, pattern piece on top, pattern weights, is going to be a really good option, because when you put pins in, you do kind of like raise the the fabric up a little bit, and even those tiny little bumps and raises that you can get from pins being inserted into fabric can slightly distort what you're cutting out. So being able to use pattern weights is a great option if you are good with a rotary cutter. Like I say, it's not for me, it's not my forte. I would have made an absolute pig's ear of this if I had tried to do it with a rotary cutter. I'm very glad that I went down the route that I did, which was literally the calico muslin and lots of pins in the seam allowance around the perimeter of the full pattern pieces and cutting out on a single layer. If you don't want to go down the calico route, I would still highly recommend that you make any pattern pieces that are to be cut on the fold into a full pattern piece so that you can lay it out on a single layer of fabric. I personally think that cutting this out on the fold would have ended up with some very wonky crooked seams. I think trying to get this fabric on the straight of grain whilst having a fold down it would have been really difficult. So I would highly recommend that you cut these kinds of fabrics out with a single layer. It will take you longer, but as I said earlier, all the prep work at the beginning of making something out of a fabric like this will make the actual sewing part of the process that much easier and hopefully more enjoyable. If you guys have any other tips and tricks for working with slippery, lightweight fabrics, let me know in the comment section down below. I would love to hear what you guys use as your tips and tricks. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.